In class and in a previous art break, we had spoke about how Pope Julius II in Rome had summoned Michelangelo, hearing about his David, and had summoned him to come and work on a number of projects in Rome as part of what Pope Julius is planning as a total rebuilding of the great capital. And this included a number of fantastic projects, including rebuilding the cathedral marking the grave of St. Peter's, but many other things. As part of that project, not only does he summon Michelangelo in 1505, but in 1508, Pope Julius also summoned Raphael to come and work for him in Rome. And what he's doing in Rome is assembling all of the best talent in Italy to come and work for him. He really wants to assemble around him everybody that is worth anything at the time and create a new capital in Europe where the best of the best of the best can be found. Raphael comes to Rome, works for the Pope, but also continues his stock in trade. We had seen him doing a number of different Madonna and Child images while in Florence, the one on the right, the small Cowper Madonna from his time in Florence, where he had been mostly influenced by Leonardo da Vinci. However, as he gets to Rome, he continues his stock in trade. He continues to make these images of the Madonna and Child, only this time significantly more under the influence of Michelangelo, this massive figure, muscular and monumental, owing everything really to Michelangelo's designs and paintings for the Sistine ceiling. Remember that they are both working for Pope Julius II, so Raphael had every opportunity to see Michelangelo's works. In Rome, Pope Julius gives Raphael his second largest painting commission, which is a suite of 4 private rooms set aside for the Pope's exclusive use, the stanze. And the first of these 4 rooms, as you walk through them, is the room of the signatures, the stanza della segnatura. This is the room where he signed official documents, thus the room of the signatures. And on the walls depicts his 4 areas of study. The place where he signed signatures was also his private library, so the center of this room would have been stocked with books. And the images on the wall illustrate the 4 primary areas of his study, of his interest. So on the right we see poetry and philosophy illustrated, and we'll look more at these in just a second. And on the opposite walls we have law and theology. These are the 4 main areas of the Pope's interests, each of them thematized in pictures on the wall. For poetry, we have a scene that's often referred to as Parnassus. Parnassus is the hill where Apollo, the sun god, lived, and he is illustrated at the very center of the composition here in the print after it by Marcantonio Raimondi and in Raphael's original painting. He's playing the harp, and he's surrounded by ancient poets and various other muses that inspire his song. Again, we've talked about the fact that in the Renaissance, we see artists and their patrons becoming increasingly interested in Roman subject matter, non-Christian subject matter. And this extends even to the Pope, where here to illustrate poetry and philosophy, we'll see ostensibly non-Christian scenes from ancient mythology, Greco-Roman mythology, in the Pope's private rooms. And so when working in Rome, Raphael picks up a printmaker to work directly for him, Marcantonio, who makes prints after many of Raphael's compositions, not only his most famous paintings, but also prints after his drawings as well, as part of a way of sort of navigating the market for art in 16th century Rome. And we're very fortunate at the National Gallery to have this print after one of the frescoes in the Sistine, not the Sistine, in the Vatican Palace, in the Pope's private chambers. People bought these as souvenirs, and they circulated throughout all of Europe, helping Raphael's designs and Raphael's ideas to spread really everywhere. We're going to focus much more, excuse me, on the fresco that illustrates philosophy, ancient philosophy, which we now see in detail on the left. In this case, Raphael has illustrated the greatest philosophers from the ancient world, ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, gathered together in a single room. Now, these people lived at different eras and different centuries even, and Raphael has come up with this fictional gathering, where it's as if they were in one room at the same time. This shows us Julius II, the Pope's interest in classical antiquity. The Pope finding the value in reading these ancient philosophers. It also is intended as a metaphor for what Julius is trying to do in Rome in the 16th century, gather together all of the greatest minds at once. That's exactly what Raphael shows in the ancient world. And to draw a connection between the gathering of ancient philosophers and contemporary Rome, what Raphael has done is to make the building look just like St. Peter's. St. Peter's was a work in progress. We saw that when we talked about Michelangelo. Was never really completed until around the 1550s, 1560s, and stood as a bit of a shell prior to that. Here, in a drawing of St. Peter's in progress by Martin van Heemskerk, we can see the massive size of the project and the state in which it stood at the time that Raphael painted the School of Athens. And you can see, I think, pretty clearly that the architecture that the philosophers are gathered in is in fact intended to resemble St. Peter's. And there's a statue on the left of Apollo, who we just saw in the poetry fresco, holding his lyre, his harp. And you can see that this figure is a loose quote of some of the designs that Michelangelo is coming up with for Julius's tomb. So this is really very much intended to be a metaphor for Julius's modern Rome, just as these ancient philosophers are gathered together fictionally in Raphael's picture, so too the greatest people in Europe are gathering together to work on projects sponsored by Pope Julius II. Now, what he shows us, Raphael, is a pair in the center, and you can see they're kind of highlighted against the sky and directly beneath that archway. These are the two greatest philosophers of the ancient world, Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. Again, they lived about a century apart in reality, but each one of them holds a volume in their hands of their most famous works, which allows us to identify them very clearly. And over and above that, they also use their hands to gesture toward the source of their philosophy. For Plato, as we talked about in class, truth lies in the mind, the human mind, not on the earth. Truth lies in metaphysics, in studying idealized forms. Whereas with Aristotle, truth lies from studying nature. And so Plato points toward the heavens, the source of true knowledge, and Aristotle gestures out toward the earth, which for him is the source of true knowledge. Together, these two approaches marry and allow us to join the ancients in our quest for knowledge. If we look more closely at the face of Plato, there is some question as to whether or not that's meant to be a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. Here's a self-portrait drawing by him in silver point, lovely drawing, showing him to emerge out of his standard sfumato lighting on the far right, and Raphael seems to have based his image on Leonardo. The only reason I have a question mark here is that Leonardo wasn't part of Julius's team. He wasn't one of the great minds that had come to Rome yet at this particular point in his history. He would get there, but only later, after Julius II had died, after Raphael had finished the School of Athens. So it's an interesting idea that he's based on Leonardo, the greatest mind, maybe homage from Raphael, who had met Leonardo while he was in Florence, but also perhaps a signal that Julius might well have wanted to invite him down to Rome. This points to an interesting thing, is that we have quite a few places in the School of Athens where we have portraits of contemporary people posing as these ancient philosophers. Now, the way that Raphael has organized the entire composition is that the people that are on Plato's side, your left, are those people who study metaphysics, those people who, like Plato, believe that truth lies in the human mind only and not in the earth and its manifestations in the earth. So here we see Socrates in green teaching the children of Athens. He too is a Platonic metaphysical philosopher. On the opposite side are people who study natural phenomenon. In this case, Zoroaster, who studies astronomy, holding a heavenly globe, the globe of the stars. Ptolemy, who studies geography, holding a globe of the earth. These are the people who study the world around us. What's interesting about the two of them is they're both looking off to the right at these two people who are smiling out toward us as they enter. The one behind them, the one who seems to be the source of the focus of their gaze, is actually Raphael himself, in the guise of the ancient painter Apelles, who was court painter to Alexander the Great Greek king. What better place for Raphael than the greatest painter from antiquity, now revived in Raphael himself? Another portrait that people have pointed to is Euclid, the philosophical master of geography, geometry, is shown with the features of the elderly architect Bramante, whose building we see standing behind them, the one who had laid out the plan for St. Peter's Cathedral in Julius's new renovation. Now, the story is told about how, while painting this, Raphael one night snuck into the Sistine Chapel to see what Michelangelo was up to. These two rooms are separated pretty much by a wall. It takes a bit to get from one to the other if you're in the Vatican, but they're very, very close to each other. And Raphael, we're told, one night wanted to see what Michelangelo was up to. So he snuck into the Sistine ceiling at night, climbed up the scaffolding, and looked at Michelangelo's frescoes, and was so absolutely stunned that he began to change the style of his figures to resemble Michelangelo's that much more. So remember, Michelangelo's Creation of Adam is being painted at pretty much the same time and about a room away from here. And Raphael sees these figures and starts to make his figures much more muscular, much broader, much more monumental, having seen Michelangelo's progress on the Sistine ceiling. And we can look back at the preparatory drawings that Raphael made for the School of Athens, and one of the things that we see when we see his preparatory drawings is that this figure here was not in any of the preparatory drawings. He seems to have been a later addition. And if we look at him, we find out that he has the features of Michelangelo. Michelangelo had a broken nose. He got into a fight when he was a teenager at the house of Lorenzo de' Medici, no less, with another artist. And here he's leaning on a block of uncut marble. There's more uncut marble around his feet. This is Michelangelo in the guise of the ancient philosopher Heraclitus. And as we look at him, he's also the biggest figure there, the most muscular, the broadest, the most monumental of all the figures. And indeed, his pose seems derived from, not directly echoing, but derived from the sorts of muscular figures that Michelangelo was painting on the Sistine ceiling at exactly this time. So he has now included himself, or included his colleague, Raphael has, in the painting. Well, Julius II died in 1513. Raphael and Leonardo both died in 1519. With that, the High Renaissance is basically over. We stir into the mix the fact that Martin Luther had begun the Protestant Reformation in 1517, questioning the authority of the Pope, questioning the authority of the Church. All of this really spells an end to the Italian Renaissance. The artists live on, many of them. Michelangelo lives into the 1560s, and that's kind of another story. But what we'll see up next is that art begins to change after about 1520, in part due to the passing of the great masters Raphael and Leonardo, but in part due to the uncertain times of which Martin Luther was a part.